So welcome everybody, as I mentioned, to the Circular Buildings Coalition webinar, where we will be going into a little bit more detail on the deep dive research that's been carried out over the past few months and how it leads into the exciting open call opportunity that we have that we're launching again for the second time in 2025 as well. Nice to meet you all. I'm Max Russell. I'm a senior consultant based in Arup, based in London, and I'm one of the members of the Circular Buildings Coalition, along with our partners here. So as mentioned, we will be going through some of the challenge areas, but also framing and giving a little bit more of an overview on the open call as well. Also joining here today are two colleagues and two organisations that have been part of the Circular Buildings Coalition since its start in 2022. It's Carolina Montano-Owen from WGBC and Thung from the Structural Collective, but through Metabolic has also been doing a lot of support and a lot of engagement on the Circular Buildings Coalition as well. We will have a Q&A session at the end. We're saving a little bit of time, maybe 10-15 minutes for Q&As. There's a Q&A function within this Teams meeting, so feel free to, as we're going through the presentations, feel free to add your questions as we go through, and then we'll be able to come to them at the end as well, and we'll make sure that we're able to answer and address each one. So in terms of what we're going to be touching upon today, I'll provide a little bit more of an introduction about who the CBC are, the work that we've been doing very quickly, and then I will hand over to Carolina and Ivan as well to shine a light on the two deep dive topics. And then I will provide a little bit more information about the open call and some of the specific challenges that are really framing the open call that we have and that we're launching as part of the Circular Buildings Coalition. And then, as I mentioned, having some space and time for Q&As as well, both in relation to the deep dive, but also the open call technicalities as well. So the CBC, the Circular Buildings Coalition, assuming that those joining us here today have probably heard in one form and another what the CBC is, but just to give the top line, it's an initiative that was started in 2022 with the aim of accelerating the implementation of the circular economy through the built environment, particularly focused around Europe within this iteration as well. We have several missions: creating a common language, stimulating demand for circular solutions, increasing collaboration across the supply chain, and promoting the development and uptake of scalable solutions that can really help to address the partners. The initiative is funded by the Loudest Foundation, also supported by our colleagues at Smith Innovation, and it's a coalition formed of 6 partners at present as well, which are on the screen. So some of the activities that we've been carrying out in or up until this point within the CBC, and probably you've heard of, perhaps if you joined a previous webinar, one of the key areas that we've been engaged is through the Blueprint project process. It's a similar process of an open call that we're launching again or relaunching this year, but in the previous rounds and the previous iterations, we have been going through and supporting, identifying and supporting initiatives that are serving as blueprint projects through that. What we mean by a blueprint project is that it's an initiative that can help to overcome existing market barriers to scale or to create demand, or even support the diffusion of circular solutions. So really helping the industry accelerate its transition and accelerate the uptake and adoption of circular economy practices as well. On the screen are the 10 initiatives that were highlighted and selected as part of the first wave of the blueprint projects. But how did we come to that selection? How do we kind of identify these 10 initiatives? That comes to the second half of some of the activities that we do as part of the CBC, which is really focused on understanding the sector, understanding the industry. You can find these reports online on the circularbuildingscoalition.com. And these last year or the preceding years have diagnosed the challenges and done some really deep and insightful research about what the current state is of the circular economy in Europe as well, looking at the flows of materials, but also identifying some of the systemic challenges that circular economy practices are facing and limiting its scaling. A second report, which was launched last year, is also looking at the opportunities and the pathways towards 2050 and what some of the particularly mitigation reduction potential there is for circular economy approaches as well. And so it's through this understanding of the current state of the circular economy within the sector that we have been going through and identifying, exploring and highlighting what are some of those challenges, what are some of the key areas that the industry is facing, and then on that, how might we develop challenges or how might we support and activate the industry to start addressing some of those pressure points and some of these pressure challenges. So the first cohort of blueprint projects and the open call was based on some of the research that we did in these two reports that you can see on the screen here. And it's with this same logic and this same intent that we're launching this year's open call for 2025. Now we're diving a little bit more, a little bit deeper into those challenges, into the sector, into a couple of specific areas as well. And so that's what Carolina and Ivan will be talking to today, a couple of the deep dive researches that we've been carrying out, really to help to surface some of these challenges. And yeah, as I mentioned, feeding through to this year's open call for blueprint projects. So without further ado, happy to hand over to our first deep dive presenter, which is Carolina. Over to you.
Thank you, Max, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining our second webinar, and I'm happy to give you some insights of our publication coming up in a couple of weeks or months about how can we support creating local economies with complete cycling of concrete. So this is one of the deep dives that we carry out as part of a group of around 30 actions that we identify that contributing to the decarbonization and the circular economy in the built environment in the European context. So just to give you some background, I'm sure you are well with most of these statistics, but in the next slide, you will see what is the impact of the concrete industry. So I think we all know that it's the most consumed material in the world, second only to water, but it's a huge industry. So it provides millions of jobs around the world, and it has a market size value over $340 billion, growing at an annual rate of around 5%. But we also know that the impacts to the environment are quite significant. So around 7% of the annual global CO2 emissions and around 4% in Europe. And also looking at the waste, so construction waste accounts for over a third in Europe, which over 50% is looking into concrete, not to mention all the natural resources that it consumes globally. So that's why we saw the need and the opportunity to look further into how can we make this industry more sustainable. And in the next slide, I want to make a reference about decarbonization versus circularity. So in general, we always say that circularity is one of the tools that supports decarbonization, but in the industry of concrete is a little bit different. So in the industry of concrete, the emissions come mainly from cement and more specifically from clinker, so nearly 95%, which accounts for over 90% of the material composition of cement. Energy emissions from heating the kilns accounts for approximately 35% and the calcination process around 50%. So circular practices influences the beginning and the end of this graph. So we can reduce emissions related to the extraction of materials and related to logistics and transport. But this might not be quite significant if we look into the overall emissions and the overall cycle of emissions in the concrete industry. So that's why we need to have hand in hand low carbon technologies, and the circularity will have a huge influence in terms of the resource or the extraction of natural resources. So that's also very key for us to keep in mind. Now, in the next slide, I just wanted to share a little bit of the methodology. So we conducted tester research, and we have quite a few interviews with experts around the value chain, from manufacturers to academics to city authorities, to see what are the opportunities around circular concrete. And we are at the final stage of this research project, where the publication is under consultation, and you will be able to find it in a couple of weeks, as I was mentioning. So one of the main sections of our publication is on the next slide. We were inspired on the waste hierarchy, and we were looking how that would look like into the concrete industry. So we are looking here at this cycling of concrete hierarchy, and how can we help guiding the prioritization of certain practices. So of course, we begin by rethink and redesign. So this alludes to how can we prioritize retrofit instead of new construction, and how can we also prioritize modular construction. In terms of reducing the amount of cement, as I was mentioning, amount of cement or clinker is the most direct way to reduce concrete emissions. So cement can be reduced by enabling flexibility in the mix design with performance specification. But there are also some mixing methods that can also create high strength concrete in a lower volume of cement. And there are also new technologies. So clinker could be replaced by supplementary cementitious material, or SCMs. That includes, for instance, the calcinated clay. So there is a lot of research and innovation in that field. And we, of course, can also help reducing waste during construction processes, but also during the demolition or the deconstruction of structures. In terms of repair, so a repair refers to keeping the products at the highest value possible, and therefore extending its lifespan. So buildings and structures are no different than other products. They should be monitored, and their performance can be restored and extended. In the next slide, we can see the other strategies. So we can use reuse directly parts of buildings, so concrete elements, and we can also look into the recycling part. In recycling, we have 2 to 3 categories. So upcycling, which is where we are looking into opportunities where high value cementous materials come from the waste of concrete. This is still very rare, and there are a few research projects on this and pilots, but we are talking mostly about recycling and downcycling. So basically, when we crush concrete and we use it as aggregates, either for buildings, or as we call downcycling, when we use it for the lowest value in construction, we will be the base for roads and earthworks. And then coming up next, we analyze what are the challenges and opportunities, and why are some regional disparities about the rate of circularity in construction in concrete in Europe. So we're looking into demand and infrastructure. We found out that the availability and cost of natural resources play a big role in Europe. So some parts in Southern and East Europe have a great availability of natural resources, and therefore it's cheaper to produce new concrete rather than looking into strategies to recycle or reuse. We also saw various differences in terms of landfilling and cost, and also in enforcement of the law of landfilling. And of course, there is a challenge around the infrastructure and logistics. So many places in Europe and around the world still lack of the appropriate storage facilities and the digital platforms to connect the value chain. In terms of technology and end-of-life practices, I think the main challenge is around the lack of information, the demolition audits, and the construction protocols. So there is an opportunity here to guide the city authorities on how to improve those data points. In the next slide, we've seen challenges around Europe, so policy and ownership. We saw that the quantity of recycled concrete aggregates that can be used is quite limited, so there is an opportunity to upgrade those policy regulations. And of course, there is an opportunity here to kind of balance carrot and stick. So there are very new but appropriate methods to promote circularity, such as the take-back schemes. But there is also an opportunity to enforce, for instance, landfill taxes, and looking also at the EU taxonomy that is promoting the circularity and the minimizing the use of natural resources. And last but not least, the perception and market and innovation. So it is an opportunity for all of us to show the secondary materials can have the same performance as traditional materials under different circumstances. So here is an opportunity here for us to promote those performance-based certificates. And last but not least, I just want to show you kind of the key highlights of the publication that is coming up. So in the next slide, as I was mentioning in the beginning, circular and low carbon practices in concrete production, maintenance, and end of life are required hand in hand to achieve a decarbonized and resource efficient built environment. There are innovative and exemplary practices around Europe, but we still need to enhance the collaboration and the frameworks so that we can have more of them and we can scale up the solutions. So there are opportunities to show the business case, how can we improve the demand and therefore the cost of those new solutions, and how can we improve the infrastructure and collaboration frameworks at the same time upgrading the policies and incentives. So please keep an eye on the publication, and happy to share how we can tackle some of those challenges. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Carolina. And yeah, very, very interesting research. And as you mentioned, very excited for the publication to be launched very shortly. If you do have any questions as we're going through, feel free to use the Q&A function in the chat. And then after the presentations, we'll be able to have a Q&A session as well. With that being said, happy to hand over to Ivan, who is exploring a deep dive on insurance for secondary materials. So over to you, Ivan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Max. The issue of how to deal with the insurance for secondary materials is something that came up quite a lot in our previous researches, something that was mentioned a lot by some contractors and building owners, that there is some level of risk that they would like some assurances for. And so what we try to do in our research is to get in touch with these organizations, so both material providers, some contractors, and the insurance themselves, to understand what the actual issue is and what the underlying systemic challenge is. So I think, first of all, if you talk with some material providers, they will tell you that actually the materials they offer might be even of higher quality than virgin materials because they've lasted for a very long time in the building, and that the issue of risk and quality is really something of perception and awareness. And I think this is certainly true and acceptable in the case of creating some sort of smaller projects, or really projects where there's really an intrinsic motivation of some of the building owners to drive forward circularity and sustainability. However, what we also noticed and what we understood is that once the projects grow in size, the calculus changes a little bit because of a few reasons. One of them is that often there's an extra layer of management in between, sometimes offered through a professional service, who just have it as part of their professional obligation to manage risk. So they need to have a very clear idea of what the risks are of using certain materials. And a second driver is that, if the material fails, the economic consequences can also be larger in sort of more professional and sort of larger organizations. So project size is an important component there. This is, of course, a little bit of a shame because the risk part is then being used as some excuse or a reason not to use these materials. And there's, I think, a lot of unrealized benefits because using secondary materials just leads to a reduction of carbon and material use all across the industry. Next slide. But what we also saw is that there's sort of different ways that people that still want to pursue with using secondary materials have found to mitigate these types of risks. So I would just put them into 3 buckets. One of them is just assuming a higher uncertainty in the performance of a product. So for example, you could over-dimension things, use them from different such that you use a bigger beam or something like that, or you would if you use some kind of cladding, you assume that it will leak more often, and so you add some facilities to prevent that. The second one would be cascading of products. So instead of using a product really for the original use, for example, some kind of load bearer thing or as a wind and water protection, you could use them for interior elements or for decorative elements, which is all very reasonable and useful, but it's also a little bit of a pity because you don't use the products at their optimal value. A second risk mitigation measure that we've seen is simply different contractual models. So for example, in a design, build, maintain, operate model, the organization that's installing also operates and maintains the building, meaning that the risk is actually transferred to that consortium rather than on the building owner. A little bit in the same bucket, I would put adjusted maintenance strategies. So you could do preventive maintenance in a more short cycle, just assuming that the products would last shorter. The third bucket I would call an increase of control of the supply chain. So you would have different types of material suppliers that would actually try to have a very clear view on the quality of the products by controlling the whole supply chain from the sourcing of the materials towards the delivery to the client. Problem with that model is that there's only it requires quite some specialized knowledge in lots of different domains, which and the result is that there's only a few companies that actually have the capability to do that. Of course, these are all just risk mitigation strategies for this sort of new type of material, and the way it's usually done with virgin materials is just through insurance. Next slide. And so, yeah, we then decided to have a look. Okay, so why is it the case that insurance for secondary materials is not really mainstream yet? And what are the different types of insurances and the different types of risks that need to be covered? If we just look at the different types of products that are usually in a building, it is quite convenient that you can categorize them according to building layer, and they also more or less match with the type of risks that are available. Not 100%, but it's quite close. So for structure elements, thinking about wooden elements, steel elements, concrete elements, risk of failure is of course catastrophic. If something happens, you have loss of life, compromise of structural integrity. And so in order to cover that, you really need sort of unit testing. So testing each individual beam in order to be certain. Then you have other elements where the failure consequences are really a bit less large. So for example, for the skin, you can think of different types of facade claddings or bricks, sandwich panels, wood claddings, where the failure consequences are really mostly economical. Of course, if there's fire hazards, it's a little bit of a different case, but often it's just sort of economic damage. And the same for space plane elements. So tiles, some floor systems, walls. So what we then try to do is, okay, what is sort of the area where we can actually create some efficiencies? I think for the structural elements, it was a little bit less clear because you just cannot use probabilistic approaches. You really need to test the individual elements, otherwise you'll be sued. But let's say for the parts where it's mostly economical, there's some probabilistic approaches that you can take. So we really sort of dove into those skin and space plane elements. Next slide. Yes. Because the question there is really about, okay, what would be needed for an insurer to determine a premium and to offer some kind of coverage? And the answer is really quite simple, and that is data. So they will need to have some kind of data on the likely performance of the material in order to be able to determine premiums. If they don't have this data, they will calculate with more margin of safety and increase the premiums, and that makes it a little bit harder than for the materials to compete, let's say, on a level playing field with regular materials. So how would they get the data? The base case, sort of the fallback case, which sometimes happens now, if you ask an insurer to provide some kind of coverage, is that they will just ask an external party to test and certify the materials that are being used. This works. The problem is that it's just not very scalable. You need a lot of individual arrangement, and you need a lot of involvement for the insurer to do that for every product. It creates lots of friction in the process, and it makes it just very easy to choose different types of projects. So the challenge is a little bit to find ways of certification that require less involvement at the insurer, but still generates the data and then more sort of throughout the supply chain. Now there's many different pathways in which elements end up from, let's say, reclamation sourcing towards the actual building. For example, building to building, or with an organization, as we said, that has full control of the supply chain. But the case that we just sort of try to use as our case to analyze it is one in which you have basically a material dealer that only acts as a reseller, but doesn't have control of the full supply chain. And the problem of data there is, what you can see is that there's really quite a few steps where some information might be lost. So that is from dismantling to transport to reconditioning to grading and sorting to storage. So in each of these steps, if this dealer doesn't have data or knowledge or, let's say, history of the product, some uncertainties come in the process. And then basically they have two options. One option is to actually do the grading and the testing all by themselves, which can be a little bit expensive. Or they don't have the data, and it just means that it's harder to attest to the performance of the material, and then makes it a little bit more expensive. And because the margins are really quite small in the whole value chain, it can be then again quite difficult for the material to compete with normal materials. Next slide. So this comes, I think this boils down into our systemic challenge, and that is, okay, and what different methods are there for to sort of develop insurance models, and it's mostly here focused on product liability insurance, to create insurance models for secondary materials with limited, both historical data and data in the supply chain. Another question is, how can you make standardized and scalable systems for really certifying the quality and the performance of the materials throughout the whole chain, where there's possibly not always good information transfer? And then finally, how can you sort of translate that in a reduced perception of risks and really building market confidence for these kind of materials? That's it from my side.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ivan, for that. And in a similar way, looking forward to seeing the publication in several weeks. when it becomes live as well. So there's a lot more kind of rich for both of the publications, both the deep dive, lots of really rich insights that will be shared and circulated. But with those two being said, and as I framed at the start of the call, the purpose and really the methodology and the theory of change behind the Circular Buildings Coalition is to, through the research, deep dive into some of these topics, really understand what are some of those key areas for action that are needed, both in terms of kind of their impact, such as concrete and the ubiquity of concrete across the industry, but it's also its impact, environmental, economic impact across the industry as well as some of those barriers and some of those challenges, systemic challenges that are getting in the way, such as kind of the perceived risk of adopting circularity. So with this, what we've been doing is processing and synthesizing some of the insights that were coming through these deep dive researches, as well as the previous research that I highlighted earlier, as well as engagement, through our day-to-day activities and engagement with industry as well, and really coming and synthesizing some of these challenge areas to distill 3 cross-cutting challenge areas that are really the basis and the jumping off point for the open call as well. So with these 3 challenge areas that have been crafted as part of the Circular Buildings Coalition, we feel really have the opportunity to unlock some of those barriers towards that scaling of circularity. So not necessarily that one-to-one bespoke adoption of circularity, which we see quite as a prevalent method of adoption of circularity, but we really are exploring how might we unlock circularity at scale. So within this next little part, I'll go through just these 3 cross-cutting challenge areas. I should say there's a lot of more additional information online. If you go to the circularbuildingscoalition.com, you can read further exploration and elaboration and detail about each of these 3 challenge areas to give you a little bit more of a primer and inspiration for some of those open calls applications as well, which I'm sure are of particular interest. So I'll just take you through briefly across each one and highlight that there are the intention of these are we're aiming to plant the seeds of inspiration of what some of the blueprint projects might look like, not necessarily what we want to stimulate is creativity and innovation and novelty in the ways in which the industry is approaching addressing these challenges. But these are a couple of examples that come through some of the research that's been carried out. So this first challenge area, it's really looking for initiatives that are helping to demonstrate assurance on the quality of secondary materials. Particularly, you can see the analogy and the similarities with some of the insights that Ivan has just highlighted in the construction deep dive, but also Carolina in relation to concrete, that assurity of what that concrete performance of that concrete might be in its second, third, X lives moving forward. So really helping at scale to provide, for example, standardized and scalable systems of validating and certifying the quality of secondary material components, particularly in perhaps a data scarce environment where historical data of the quality and the performance of those materials and components are maybe not available or not known. Another example is demonstrating scalable insurance models for secondary materials in a similar way, how to provide that assurance on the potential of fault or a potential of challenges in the future, real, perceived, or otherwise. And then also building market confidence in secondary materials through transparent, data-backed performance assurance as well. So really using data as that driver and as that enabler of some of those approaches to help to dispel some of those perceived risks in secondary materials and in secondary components as well. There's several additional examples that can be found within the briefing document that's online. So I definitely encourage you to look and explore some of those additional elements as well. The second challenge area is looking towards initiatives that help to showcase the value of secondary materials. building on from the perceived risks. Risks can be perceived to be tolerable if the value is clear, eloquent, and elaborated enough as well. And as we're finding, often preventing circularity is that the perceived risks are too high than the perceived rewards or the perceived value, and perhaps there's this mismatch between those who bear the risk and those who are set to receive the value as well. So we're really looking for initiatives that can help to demonstrate that value and practices, generating new revenue streams and unlocking finance for circular models at scale. So in a similar way, these could involve, for example, initiatives that can help unlock capital investments through common financing models or instruments. Particularly, there's this sense of a higher upfront cost, albeit maybe the total cost of ownership may be lower, but how might that finance be unlocked and enabled to account for those? Also looking for initiatives that help to demonstrate standardized approaches, for example, on the discounted cash flow model, and articulating the financial benefits of circular business models in practice as well. How can that help to gather the evidence base behind these circular business models that on paper, are very compelling? We're really looking for how to demonstrate that at scale and provide the evidence base of that towards scaling. And then thirdly here, looking to promote demand by unlocking some of the barriers related to logistics, infrastructure for the value chains of secondary materials, those costs that might be associated, in particular in concrete cycling, for example, those requirements for logistics and infrastructure. Where might those costs be borne across the value chain? So really helping to calling for blueprint projects and initiatives that can help to alleviate some of those challenges there in relation to those related costs. And then the third challenge area is in relation to unlocking data and information flows across the value chain to really help stimulate and support the reuse and cycling of secondary materials and components as well. So in particular, looking for projects that can help to support transparent sharing of data used, data and information across the value chain. Increasingly data is being used and data is being adopted, but too often it's being, the flow of information is limiting the flow of materials as well. For example, with a building, if you prospect that urban mine, seeing a building as a potential material bank, the way in which we can alleviate some of those logistics and storage costs, which are quite demanding, is being able to matchmake and support the really efficient matching of a steel product in building A that can then directly or almost directly be transported into building B. That can only happen if the data flows and the information's in the right place at the right time. So for example, three of the numerous examples that are on the guidance document that's online. So we're looking for initiatives that could employ digital technology and data to, as I mentioned before, help to matchmake secondary materials to reduce those logistics and storage costs. Solutions that help to enhance the transparency of the availability of materials through tracking, monitoring, material passports, for example, can come under that category. And then also we're looking for projects that can help scale and expedite the cataloging of those materials for existing real estate assets to improve that transparency of that future material availability and that stock as well. So really helping to understand what data that we have, but also how to share transparently that information so that it can really facilitate, unclog that data system so that materials can also flow for their second and third life. So as a summary, we have the open call, which is really looking to help to support initiatives and projects that can accelerate the adoption of circular economy practices across Europe's built environment, and in particular looking at those three challenge areas. Now, your initiative might be able to address really effectively one of those. It may also be able to affect 2 or 3 even of those, recognizing that it's difficult to put some of these challenges just in a very neat boundary. So we're really looking for that novelty and that openness of how initiatives or a collection of initiatives with different stakeholders can come together and help to scale or help to demonstrate that scaling. Some of the important information: what's the deadline and how much is available? So the deadline is on the 11th of May. That's a Sunday. Hopefully try not to leave it to the Saturday to start drafting up the application, but the 11th of May at 11 o'clock in the night, Central European time. Now, as part of the Blueprint project process, the selected organizations, and there's up to 6 in this cohort, can receive up to 70,000 euros of funding, as well as expert mentoring as well. So more of the key information: who can apply? So it can be almost any startup, company or organization. Particularly, there's a focus on Europe, and by Europe, it's the EU 27 plus, so plus the UK, Norway, and Switzerland. There are some exclusionary criteria, which I do definitely encourage you to take a look at as I said, the briefing document that's online. How can you apply? So if you go online to the open call page on the circularbuildingscoalition.com, you can find the application questions. It's an online application form. You're able to download the application questions ahead of time as well to help you draft your responses. Initially, there's a set of eligibility questions that I really encourage you as early as possible to go through and just explore whether you fulfill that eligibility criteria as well. Why apply? Through the Circular Buildings Coalition and in the opening webinar that we had just over a week ago, whereby 2 of the 10 Blueprint projects were able to showcase their experiences. Some of the key areas that can be supported through the Circular Buildings Coalition is, one, to create impact. Ultimately, the Circular Buildings Coalition is really trying to unlock some of those initiatives that can help the scaling of circularity and its benefits. To secure funding, and that I think speaks for itself, but also to access and share through the network and the knowledge network of the Circular Buildings Coalition, both the organizations that are part of and partners of the Circular Buildings Coalition, but also the cohort and the previous cohorts of the 10 organizations that have been part of this Blueprint project process as well. So lots of fantastic knowledge sharing and opportunities to synergize and align on those initiatives. A few dates to bear in mind and keep right in the front of your mind. As I mentioned, the 11th of May, the Sunday, is when the open call application process closes. So definitely have that in the forefront of your mind. It was launched, the open call process was launched a couple of weeks ago. So we're towards the end of March. So we have another month and a half to go. One future date to be aware of and pencil into your calendar is on the 24th of April, so just under a month's time, where we'll have the 3rd webinar in this series. Now, this webinar, recognizing its proximity to the closing date, is really an information and Q&A session as well, to help to respond to any questions and clarifications that are coming up as you're drafting that process. Last week we had the opening. This week was a bit more of the content and the detail behind that. This one will be particularly in relation to the information as well and clarifications. Then in June, our intention is to announce the winners in June once they've been selected through the Circular Buildings Coalition panel process. And then how long will it run for, this Blueprint project process? It will be a 6-month process being announced in June, with the anticipation of starting and kickstarting activities and the mentoring program in July 2025 as well. And that will run through to the end of the year to December as well. What are the outputs? What are the anticipated and expected outputs? So what we would really love and what we're really aiming to cultivate are real-world demonstrations. So taking away from the conceptual space and really understanding how can these initiatives and these approaches be scaled or support the real world scaling of circular economy practices and principles. Through that process, the intention is to really diffuse those solutions to target stakeholders, with the outputs at the end to support the real world demonstration is the development of a concise but importantly publicly facing outputs, and we've left that open to be able to have a discussion about what that may look like. It doesn't have to be a dry kind of PDF report necessarily, but a publicly facing output that helps to really summarize the initiative and the lessons learned from that piloting process as well. If you want some examples of the first cohort, again, you can see the Circular Buildings Coalition webpage online, where you can see the outputs of those 10 initiatives there for inspiration as well. There's a QR code here. There's also the link to the Circular Buildings Coalition webpage, and we have an email address that we monitor, which is info@circularbuildingscoalition.org as well. If you have any questions as you're going through, you can also reach out to us, for example, on LinkedIn or other means as well. We're happy to speak and clarify anything if they come up. And with that, that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour about the open call process. And we have just over 10 minutes to open up the floor for some questions as well. If there's any questions or clarifications, both for the deep dive process or the deep dive research, but also the open call process as well. So do feel free to use the Q&A function in the chat as well. I believe our chat is locked and also the camera is locked, but we can have a look and we can monitor those. But perhaps while we wait for some questions as they come through, I can ask one, maybe Carolina, to you as well, maybe initially just to kick us off. And my question is, what was one of your most kind of surprising findings through the research on concrete cycling? Some things may be more familiar. What was your most kind of aha moment, light bulb moment, and surprising insights through that process?
Thank you, Max. I think it was a pleasant surprise to see that there is so much research going on in both in how to improve circularity practices, but also in terms of decarbonizing the concrete industry. And I'm happy to see as well that in general, all the manufacturers are kind of aligned in how to decarbonize the industry. So that was a pleasant surprise. I guess on the other hand, what I was seeing is that there are just a few examples of that we will see more like fully circular practices, right? Like from cradle to cradle, let's say. And the hurdles came from the logistics part of it, so kind of connecting the value chain and having those in place, logistics, the facilities, the storage facilities, the information there. So I think that is where the highest opportunity is. But as I said, that is not only a challenge but an opportunity, and there is a great option to grow and see more innovation in that sense.
Fantastic. Yeah, very interesting one. And maybe Ivan as well, a question to you would be, based on your conversations, how close or distant do you find kind of the insurance industry and stakeholders aligned with circular economy and maybe sustainability principles? How far do you think those worlds perhaps are at the moment, or are you quite encouraged to see those two worlds aren't necessarily too far apart?
Thanks, Max. First of all, I just wanted to check if the people can actually ask questions. I'm not sure if I could. Well, maybe I'm just not seeing them. But okay. How far are they apart? No, I think it was quite encouraging. I mean, we talked to a few insurers that for which it is sort of slightly on the radar. I know of two instances in which a specific product liability insurance was developed in collaboration with a secondary material products provider. So one of them is part of our previous blueprint project around concrete, and another one in Denmark, and there's also one in France. But as you can see, there's examples that I can count with one hand and I can name them. So it's not a lot yet. There's still also quite a bit of lack of awareness, I think, because the products are not used, everywhere at the moment. So it's not always specifically on the radar, which can make it difficult. If you want to insure your materials in some kind of way, often you need like a whole bespoke process with some kind of insurance company. And there's just not a way, this is not very scalable, let's say. So I do see some signs of progress, signs of early initiatives, but I really hope that through this process, that accelerates a little bit.
Perfect. Thank you, Ivan. And I do see a question coming through from John Somerville. Do you consider a scalable new recycled panel material in scope? And yeah, that's a really interesting question as well. I think so. The way in which we're approaching the open call process and the blueprint projects is, that key on the blueprint component. So projects and initiatives that can really serve as that blueprint for either replication or adoption at scale. So it's very much on that scalable element. So it's less of a bespoke product or a new product in itself. But if there's a process and something that can be applied and replicated across the industry that can really support, recycled products being adopted and scaled as a broad sense, or as a broad kind of practice for the industry to help additional products and additional elements being cycles, is there a novel or new way that there's been engagement with the supply chain, with the industry, etc., to develop that material, that panel? That would definitely be incredibly interesting in aligning with some of those challenge areas that we've outlined as well. Not necessarily the quote unquote product in and of itself, but really how it fits in with that ecosystem of the system as well. And also, Ivan and Carolina, feel free to also come in if you had different thoughts on that as well. That sounds good. So are you aiming, there's another question from Dominic. Are you aiming to fund a specific stage or of project/business, or open to all stages of product maturity as well? It's a really good question. As I mentioned or kind of alluded to within the presentation, it's less towards a concept phase. It's less towards just that really initial and early prototyping per se. If we're looking at the technology readiness levels, it's less on those 1, 2, 3 stages, and much more moving towards that demonstration and real world demonstration of that solution towards that scaling. So it could be applied within one geography, wanting to scale out to another, or applying this concept, this scalable concept in practice for that first time as well. So it's less of those early conceptualization and development of a particular solution, really helping to identify some of the approaches and solutions that are in their infancy, to really kind of activate and support those as well. So within kind of the technology readiness level of about 5 and beyond as well, if that helps to resonate, or if that means something there. But hopefully the explanation also kind of helped to clarify that. Fantastic. Any other final opportunities for final questions? As I mentioned, this will be recorded and put available online. Any of the questions will be synthesized and made available on a FAQ section, which also holds the questions that were asked in the opening webinar that we have, and inevitably through the clarification question webinar as well next month, at the end of next month, but recognizing that's much closer to the end of the deadline as well. So happy if there are any other final questions, but also happy to close off with that as well. So just to express a really massive thanks to Carolina, Ivan as well for your insights today, and for everyone joining this afternoon. Feel free to reach out if there's any questions as they come through, and we're very much excited to see your applications as they come through for the open call.